Hi, welcome to the Life Expansion After 50 podcast. In today's episode, I'll be talking about self-determination theory and why it's such a powerful resource when it comes to high performance. To first give you a sense of how this came about, I have there are a few defining moments for me throughout my leadership time. One is in both officer school and ranger school. We had these things called peer reviews, and 3 times during this cycle, there was a peer review, and you had to rank the top 5 people in your group, in your class, and the bottom 5 people in your class. In both of these schools, they worked towards a nutrition goal because they wanted the best, right? So they had different ways of doing it. In Ranger School, it was all sorts of things. If you fell 2 steps behind in a run and it happened twice, you were gone. If you were peer reviewed out, you were gone. Same with officer candidate school. If you were peer reviewed out, you were gone. And there were other things that they did as well, scores and things like that. But the peer review was interesting because having gone through it twice, and you would see people disappear after the peer review. They would just be gone. You might catch them with their things packed up leaving, but for the most part, I guess they did that at night, so you didn't see it happening. All of a sudden, they're gone. And it got to the point where you could predict who was at risk of being peer reviewed out. Second thing that happened was going through those schools, and then I was a construction officer, so I had like $2 million worth of equipment that I signed for, and there was a lot of autonomy for the people who were working because you got a bulldozer operator and a bucket loader operator and dump truck operators, and they were all over the place. And I had a Jeep, and my driver would drive me around, and I would check on the jobs and things. But there was a lot of autonomy, and these people had to manage themselves. They had to be self-reliant and have initiative, but still within a command and control structure. So that was interesting. The next thing was moving into the corporate world in sales and having to lead people and pulling in some of that command and control, which obviously didn't work very well. And where I worked was there was an upward communication, very strong upward communication process. Things like opinion surveys and reviews, et cetera. But there was a lot of upward communication, which I wasn't used to in the Army. So I had to reset that. Fast forward, I got into a great situation. I was building high-performing teams. I had large projects, and they grew, obviously. They didn't start large, but they grew. They kept growing. And I was building high-performing teams using principles I learned from certifying in neurolinguistic programming 5 years before that period. This was in the mid-90s. And I got to the point where I was recognizing that the things that I was doing was different than what some of the leaders around me were doing. And it got to the point where there became some tension. And fortunately, I was able to create a bubble when I operated inside of that bubble where I did the things that I believed were right based on what I learned from neurolinguistic programming, experiences in the Army, et cetera, and what worked. They did a lot of testing. So I based it on what worked. It was a very empirical approach. And I read a lot of books. So I worked hard to apply what I was learning in the books. The interesting thing happened is that I led a project. It was my idea to model leadership behaviors of the best. And out of that, I was surprised, as was the consulting firm I was working with, how much of the behaviors they couldn't describe. They didn't know why they were doing these things, which led me to believe that conditioning played a much larger role. And at that time, it still is, but behavioral descriptive interviewing was very popular. And the way behavioral descriptive interviewing works, you're essentially selecting people based on their habits, based on how they performed in the past. But how they performed in the past was associations and habits. And most people agree that 95% of everything we do is done by habit. So when you start looking at it as this was habitual, now that's leaders in a corporation, not leaders in small businesses and entrepreneurs. And that's the intersection. That's where I bring in dynamic leadership for small business owners, because the leadership skills that are sought in large corporations, it's influenced by what the board needs. So the leaders in corporations are not just leading their area, they're actually having to respond to what the board wants. The board selects the leaders, the board selects the CEO, and they they say what's important. So it makes sense that they're pulling in people who have these right attributes. And there's different ways of talking about it. We can get into that in another conversation, but talk to some HR recruiters and I'm sure they'll tell you some stories. And again, that's separate from entrepreneurs, which was more like athletes. When you talk to them about how they became successful, they know what they did. They knew the steps. They could speak it out. I wasn't getting that with the corporate leaders. So that was a huge aha. And then what happened, this is the last part of it. If you think about driving down a dark road with no ambient lighting, and the person who's going to end up going the fastest will be the one who has the best headlights, all things being equal. And so if you think about leaders as having headlights and out into the distance, and what you want is a leader who has headlights that go further and further out because they can see around corners. They can actually move the fastest, and people are naturally going to follow them because their headlights aren't strong enough, so they follow. You've probably been in that situation on a dark road that you're not familiar with, maybe in the snow. You follow somebody else because you're using their headlights as comfort. What was interesting is as I moved up in the organization, my headlights started outrunning the leaders that I was reporting to. And that became another interesting dynamic. So those are several things that, as I said, shaped my view of leadership. And so when I started looking at what is it the small business owners need, when I started looking at what I was learning with the neurochange work and working with the neuroscientists, and what I learned in neurolinguistic programming back in the early 90s, and used that to build high performing teams, it all started coming together into this, what leadership style is this? And I was on Leader as Coach for a long time, and I'll explain why on the next slide, but it evolved to dynamic leadership. And the reason is Leader as Coach is more applicable as there's more freedom of action, and freedom of action increases as you go up in the leadership ranks. So obviously the leaders in the C-suite have an enormous amount of freedom of action and responsibility that goes with it. Whereas on the front line, they don't have as much freedom of action. So there's less coaching. So Leader as Coach would not serve well as we moved down that line. Dynamic leadership does. And then with dynamic leadership, Leader as Coach comes in up here. And like I talked about last week, I have a Leader as Coach, and we also have the situational leadership, because you've got to be able to adjust to the situation and reading what's going on with the people. And then the other one is transformational leadership. So these are like three pillars that go with dynamic leadership. And transformation leadership, especially in a VUCA environment, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, there's a lot of projects that are going to happen. We have to be adjusting to what's going on. Call it pivots, call it projects. It depends on the size of the shift. So those three pillars support the dynamic leadership, but dynamic leadership is the umbrella that's always at play. And then you're pulling in these other three pillars as you need them. All right. So with self-determination theory is what I want to talk about today, specifically self-determination theory and why it integrates with dynamic leadership. Now, what I'm talking about today is not specifically dynamic leadership, but this stuff is intertwined because we're talking about motivation, which means we have to talk about cognitive behavior. And so the self-determination theory, I want people to understand that, because one of the things I like about dynamic leadership is that it's very simple. It's very contained in that I can teach somebody dynamic leadership using self-determination theory. And on the day one, they will know what to do. And this slide spells it out. Self-determination theory, it's when a person or group makes their own decisions regarding their life and how it's managed. I often said that people have the capability, if you visit them at their homes and you go hang out with them, I don't care where they are on the spectrum of entry employee versus CEO, they all are very capable at managing their personal lives. at whatever level it is that they choose, whether it's traveling, setting up vacations, playing golf, whatever. They have a way of managing their life and it works. Why should we expect them to turn that off when they come to work? That's always been interesting for me. And I lean into, let's tap into that person, that full capability of the person. And self-determination theory does that. So the theory, self-determination theory, was created in 1967 by Ryan and Deci. Now, these researchers obviously was in the mental health space, so there's a lot of technical language associated with it. It wasn't really well accepted until around 2000, and I think the neuroscientists brought that in because they said, hey, look, this is powerful. This is how the brain works. When you're trying to understand cognitive behavior, you start seeing things that maybe you didn't see before. Now, it's based on two things, as you can see there under the theory side. Human beings strive for growth, and I'm going to talk about growth as we talk about the 6 human needs, and then internal sources of motivation are essential. In order to achieve growth, people need to feel autonomous, competent, and connected. So the 3 pillars of self-determination theory are autonomy and relatedness. And that's what I meant when I said, I can tell a person, you have to make sure that whatever you do, you're leaning into these 3 things, making sure that you're looking for some opportunities for your team to have some autonomy, that you're looking for opportunities to let them know that they're competent at doing these things. They have the ability to be competent at doing these next things that are coming. And they should be increasing their confidence based on the competence that you're seeing. And they should feel good about the next tasks ahead because they have the competency to learn. That's just as an example. And then the last one is relatedness. And I call this being seen. If you take a person and they're not being seen in the workplace, they start to go into a stress response, or could. And at an extreme, a person is like they need psychological air. Being seen is giving people psychological air. This is why sometimes a person is just really like going off the deep end and going off the edge or going into the deep end. Just by listening to them, you give them this sense of relief. And that's an image of psychological air. I liken it to, if a person is drowning or you see them panicking in the water, it doesn't matter what you tell them. It doesn't matter unless it's a lifesaver, they're not interested in anything else. And in fact, they will often push the lifeguard down who's going to save them. And that's what it could look like when a person has a need for psychological air. So if you're looking at an employee and you're dealing with something and you notice that they have that look, and we'll talk about calibrating, how you calibrate to know when they're going into this space. If they've got that look, I would say back off. It doesn't make any sense to keep going forward. It would be like trying to convince a person who's drowning that their goal, that what they want to do for their goal is right around the corner, and all they have to do is step out of the pool and go get it. That's not going to stop them from wanting air at that moment. They don't care about their goal. And the same way in the workplace and the need for psychological air. All right, now the right side, stages of motivation. And this is where I wanted to talk about the leader as coach. Stages of motivation. First stage is no motivation at all. And then there's external motivation. And this is what we're used to. People think that money motivates people. It does, but it's very, very low. And this is why you can see it's only number 2 on the list, external motivation, which would be incentives and salary. This is why salary and pay can often be in the double digits. If you look at a ranking of, say, the 25 things in order that people say are important to them at work, money is often, or pay is often in the double digits. That's huge. And this, I think, explains why, because external motivation is just one beyond no motivation at all. And then there's fear-based motivation, and this is real big for the boomer generation. That's what it was, all fear motivation. But fear motivation runs out. There's only so far, because once you face the fear, the death of fear is certain. Not only that, the leverage of an impending event has more leverage than the event itself, or I should say the threat. The threat of an impending event has more leverage than the event itself, meaning that threatening to fire you if XYZ happens has a certain amount of leverage, if a person actually gets fired, they start looking for other opportunities, and then they realize that that's nothing to be afraid of, and the threat is gone, or the leverage is gone. Then recognition of activity value. This means that I'm starting to see that there's a connection of what I'm doing. This is where the gamification comes in, right? A lot of times people talk about ad gamification, and I remember Chuck Coonrod, a guy I was a distributor with back in the Success Motivation days. He wrote a book called The Game of Work, and that was the thing. He would bring gamification into the workplace, and that would be a form of motivation. And this is how you start tapping into that. You're getting closer to the intrinsic motivation. Look, the activity value, it's not just gamification. There's a study I remember, they took kids and they were paying them $5 for every hour that they kicked. Every kid got $5 for every hour that they kicked this rock around on the street. If I recall, some of them didn't even last the hour. Very few went past the 1 hour. But then they did one small thing. They set up 2 goals on each end, like soccer nets, but it's on the street. And same thing, $5 per kid per hour. And they lasted over 3 hours because they turned it into a game. These things will help you think about what is it that you need to do in the workplace for this competence. How do you convey this competence? There's another study, and while it's different, I think it's related, because it shows how fear motivation can actually become a detractor. And there was a study in Japan, and they were working to speed up the assembly line, and they could do segments of it, and they had enough evidence that the line could go this fast. This goes way back. The study was back in the 80s, I think. They could see that the line could go this fast only in segments. They could never get the entire line to go that fast, and it wasn't anything that they could observe. It was just it couldn't go that fast. What they did, they brought the workers in. This was back in the TQM days, total quality management, and the Kaizen. So there was a lot of asking why 5 times, that sort of work. And they got behind it, and they found out that the workers were afraid that somebody could get hurt. What they did was they spaced emergency stop buttons throughout the assembly line, and anybody had the authority to push the emergency stop button, no questions asked. And the assembly line hit the speed. There's a lesson there, because sometimes you just have to remove the risk or the fear or the threat for that person to move forward. If a person is afraid of losing their job, you can see that lack of having an emergency red button can actually stop them performing at their best. So I wanted to bring that out because it's a corollary to the fear-based motivation, and you can see how risks or challenges in the organization can actually inhibit people's performance. And then the fifth one is integration with beliefs. Now I'm starting to see that I believe this. This is why they say do what you love, and you'll never work a day in your life. That's also sort of number 4. This is why you want to work with companies, and you don't have to match the purpose, but you have to find your purpose within what that company is doing and within the activity that you're doing. And then the last one is inherent enjoyment. And this becomes just joy, pure joy, just from the activity itself. So that's the setup of the self-determination theory. And the way I laid that out, you could take a screenshot of that and just look at your own workplace and see where you're fitting, even without knowing anything more about self-determination theory. So here it is in the structure for dynamic leadership. You assign a task. The person has a role in their mind, their job description, but it's not necessarily what you think it is. That goes into their perception. And then there's an interpretation. This is where a lot of the work lies, right here, understanding the role and the perceptions. And this is why you have to have communication. And then there's the, obviously, interpretation of it, and then the outcome. Then the internal representation. So there's always context, and I probably overdo giving context, but it helps. It's like priming. Basically, when you give context, you are priming somebody, and people get sort of bored or agitated because they don't want the context. They just want what is it? What is it you want me to do? But without the context, you may not have the right priming. If you look at canned sales presentations and you tear them apart, what you'll see is there's a lot of priming that goes on in that sales presentation. And it's why when I talk to people about selling, you don't want to go into the presentation part of the sales presentation. So there's there's the rapport and fact finding. You don't want to go into the presentation portion until they're ready for you to go into the presentation portion. In other words, if it's not a good time to go all the way through the close, I wouldn't start the presentation, because you have to prime them along, and the sale is emotional. And if you don't do those priming steps, it's very hard to get back to that emotion-based buying intent. And of course, none of this is about nefarious. This is all 100% aligned with solving people's problems for real. I do not support any of the stuff where you're taking advantage or using this content to manipulate people, or these principles to manipulate people. It's not necessary. It's wrong. So you have context that gets into their basic psychological needs. Now, all your employees are different. And, I remember reading something long time ago, and it said that to treat everybody the same is the highest form of discrimination. And the point there is we all have the same psychological needs. I can list the 8 or the 6, but how we meet those needs and what those needs are made up of, that's different. The context around those needs are different. And that's why you want to get to know your people. So one size does not fit all. That gets into their internal motivation system. And then based on the input from the prior slide, the assigning the task, this is where you look at the consequence and engagement. So when I am working with somebody who's having some difficulty, I want to go backwards through this list to see what's going on and why what they're wanting is not what they're getting. All right, self-determination theory, structure for dynamic leadership. So you have motivation and engagement as the objective. Context and content, I talked about, the basic psychological needs. We're going to reduce them to autonomy, competence, relatedness. I mentioned the 6 needs. You have certainty, you have variety, you have connection, you have significance. But when you come down to it, and this work was done in the early 1900s, and then he was discussed again by Maslow, and he used that to build his Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the triangle. And then later on is popularized the 6 human needs by Tony Robbins. And Tony Robbins talks about how growth and contribution, the last 2, if you focus on growth and contribution, the other 4, significance, connectedness, certainty, and variety, they get met naturally rather than going after them and you're zigzagging around. I think that's a powerful point. But then you can collapse that further and say autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And the idea is the wraparound would be the contribution and growth if you want to enhance that. And you have internal motivation. So clearly, intrinsic motivation is much more powerful than extrinsic motivation. And if you're looking at building a high-performing team, you want to be relying on intrinsic motivation. When you look at sports teams, you can see it's all about intrinsic motivation. They love the activity. They have a common goal. They all want to win. They're going after it. They work in the gym extra hours. It's not about what I have to do. It's what I get to do. And then the consequence, feeling, understanding, and behavior. So this is what you don't see as the leader, but you want to learn to see the cues about what's going on with their feeling. If the person's not feeling right, you're going to have trouble getting the behavior. So you want to get behind that. I noticed a little bit of hesitancy on there when we talked about XYZ. What was going on in your mind that time? I like to lean into the word try. If I have a team member who says, yeah, then we're going to try to do XYZ, I don't want to catch it right then. I want to come back offline and one-on-one and say, I noticed that when we were talking about this part of the project, you were using the word that we're going to try. So I'm guessing that there's some elements of that you're not clear on yet, or that maybe you think there might be some difficulty. Can you share what's going on with you when you think about what's going on with that thinking when you say you want to try? And that's now, once you find that out, you can remove those barriers, because that try stuff is probably not internal, it's probably external. I'm going to leave it there for part 1. I'll pick up in part 2, starting with why intrinsic motivation is so powerful.